That relationship's been redundant. Not a single thing has come of it.
I knew when he said that this was outright deception.
Through water reform, we've seen this really divisive tactic used by governments.
Politicians are getting far too comfortable lying to our faces. And we're seeing now the third example in recent memory of politicians being challenged by actual legal experts, and those politicians simply doubling down on their lies. By and large, the mainstream media are silent on this, with a few exceptions. But here at the Aussie Wire, we believe in truth, freedom and hope. So we happen to think that politicians should tell the truth. Crazy, I know. But cast your mind back to when Daniel Andrews, the Victorian dictator, was ramming through his permanent pandemic powers bill. He claimed, laughably, that the powers in the bill were similar to powers already in place in other states. But that was a lie. The Victorian bill lacked the safeguards and limitations that existed in other states, and the Victorian Bar President, Christopher Blandon QC, said that it gave the police powers that the Stasi would be happy with. Fighting words from a man in his position. Here's an excerpt from an article from the ABC at the time. The government has faced backlash from lawyers with serious concern among the legal fraternity, especially about the lack of parliamentary oversight. Victorian Bar President Christopher Blandon QC lashed the government for a lack of consultation, warning the powers given to the government were extreme. He said the Stasi in World War II East Germany would be happy with the powers, a comment that he told ABC Mornings, and one designed to get attention. On Friday, 14 senior lawyers published an open letter arguing that the laws would allow the government to rule Victoria by decree on a long-term basis. In other words, the assurances of our politicians directly contradicted the words in the legislation. And when actual legal experts pointed out the reality of the words on the page, the politicians simply swatted them aside and rammed the bill through regardless. What are you going to believe? A politician's promises or your lying eyes? Don't believe what you read. Believe what I tell you to believe. This is not an isolated incident. The Voice to Parliament is as badly written a constitutional amendment as you can possibly imagine, which has sparked furious debate about what it would actually be empowered to do, and what the fallout would be if a government didn't take their advice into account, whatever that means. Actual legal experts are warning that this voice will be able to tie the federal government up in knots, running to the courts every single time they aren't given exactly what they want. For his part, Anthony Albanese is making things worse by changing what he says the voice will or won't be able to do. He's previously said that it would be very difficult for a government to stand up to the voice, but has since assured Australians that he will stand up to them if they, for example, tried to change the date of Australia Day. On the one hand, he tells Indigenous activists that the voice will empower them, and then turns around and reassures the rest of Australia that the voice won't have any real power, it's just an advisory body. Once upon a time, these sorts of barefaced, two-faced lies would force a politician to resign. But those days are a distant memory, with lies and deception now considered normal, coming from the people who are supposed to be the statesmen in our society. Making the voice situation properly scary is the disaster unfolding right now in WA after their updates to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act took effect at the start of this month. It was hailed as a wonderful step forward, as these things always are, but just 3 weeks later, we've seen claims from Landcare, a tree planting organisation which you would think would be welcomed by everyone, that they've had to cancel tree planting events for thousands of trees because they claimed they were told by the relevant Aboriginal corporation that they couldn't go ahead unless the corporation received a $2.5 million payment that they claimed they were owed by the federal government. In other words, you can't plant your trees on our sacred land until we get our cashola. Which does beg the question, how sacred is that land if all it takes is money? I mean, granted, a lot of money, but it's starting to sound dangerously close to extortion. But then again, I'm not a lawyer, so what would I know? The details of it all are contested. The Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Tony Beauty, denies that the Act applies to tree planting. But, and this is the problem, it's so badly written that the Aboriginal Corporation clearly thought that they had that power. Landcare had multiple people looking at the Act to try and figure it out, and in the end they couldn't figure it out, so they cancelled their plans out of an abundance of caution. Because a breach of the Act, a failure to do as you're told by one of these Aboriginal corporations, could result in up to $10 million in fines for corporations and jail time for the individuals involved. There's a lot of backpedaling going on from Landcare and from the Minister, but there is no denying that all of a sudden tree planting in West Australia has become a high-stakes affair. Planting a tree in the wrong place could put you in prison, and whilst the Minister is promising that the Act doesn't apply to tree planting, the truth is that nothing is for sure until it reaches court. The Minister can make all the assurances he wants, but if you plant a tree in the wrong spot and the relevant Aboriginal corporation wants to sue you, it's going to be up to a judge to determine what that poorly drafted legislation really means. Ministerial assurances be damned. Is this what the people of West Australia were promised when this legislation was put forward? I'll guarantee you that it was not. But a combination of the concept of such laws being flawed in the first place, plus poor drafting, plus Aboriginal corporations appearing to be keen to leverage their new powers, has created this embarrassing farce that highlights two things. One, politicians have no idea what they're doing, but will bald-faced lie to pretend that they do. And two, once laws are written, they almost always cause far more harm than was anticipated and are almost always used in ways that were not intended. If this is the unintended consequences of just updating the Aboriginal cultural heritage laws in WA, can you imagine the possible unintended consequences of enshrining an Indigenous voice into our Constitution? The honest truth is, no one can guess what a court will decide when those inevitable lawsuits begin. But as mad as that is, it's not even the worst example going around. That prize belongs to the proposed Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. Politicians are going hell for leather, promising that these new powers will protect us from people who want to manipulate us with lies. But it's the politicians themselves doing the manipulating and the lying. Take one very simple example. They assure us that the body that will have these new powers, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, is independent. Trouble is, we've heard that before. And the concept of independence is a lie when the government of the day can fire the independent body. Ask Philip Lowy how independent his role at the Reserve Bank of Australia was. The same promises were made that he was independent, but the government has now fired Philip Lowy to make a political point. What about the independence of the Victorian Police Commissioner, appointed by Daniel Andrews himself, or the Chief Health Officers? The harsh reality is that this independence is a myth. I'll go further. It's a lie. In public, they feign independence, but behind closed doors, it's a circle jerk for loyalists, given lucrative jobs for the boys' schemes, for people who are handpicked for the role, not based on merit, but on loyalty and ideological correctness in the opinion of the people doing the appointing, i.e. the government. ACMA is independent. My arse it is. This bill is not about protecting people from misinformation, it's about allowing the government of the day to define misinformation. And any politician who claims otherwise is lying to you. And just as legal experts warned against the Victorian Permanent Pandemic Powers Bill, warned against the reforms to West Australian Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, and are warning against the Voice, they're trying to raise the alarm about these new ACMA powers as well. And the concerns are all too familiar. Barrister Justin Quill wrote in The Australian that I've read the draft legislation carefully and it seemed to me that the draftsman must have been in a rush. Sound familiar? If one of the lawyers produced the sloppy drafting in this bill in my team, there would be a hard conversation being had in my office. But poor drafting is the least of my concerns, he said. You see, even the very best drafting cannot fix a bad idea, and the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill is as bad a legislative idea or concept as I've seen. End of quote. That's from Barrister Justin Quill. There is nothing special about Australia that makes us immune from the consequences of our mistakes. If we make the same mistakes as other countries in other places or at other times, mistakes like allowing the government to define what is true and what is not, mistakes like enshrining racism into our constitution and empowering a minority of people with powers that haven't even been defined and certainly cannot be understood as yet, mistakes like giving state premiers powers that, to quote again the president of the Victorian Bar, the Stasi would be happy with, then we are going to reap the consequences of those mistakes. Australia is on track to make multiple very big mistakes in a very short period of time. Defeating the Voice to Parliament and defeating this Misinformation and Disinformation Bill is vital to our future. So what can you do? I suggest you participate in providing the ACMA with feedback on your opinion of the proposed new powers, and find and support those politicians who are pushing back, and then send this episode of the Aussie Wire News to everyone you know. The sad reality is that we get the government that we deserve. And if we want better government that writes better laws, then we have to start by becoming better people. If either of these proposals succeed, then the very nature of Australia will be altered forever, and the consequences of that will be with us and our children for years, maybe decades, maybe generations. Regular viewers will have noticed a theme emerging in recent weeks here on the Aussie Wire, particularly around the importance of local councils. We've heard from Graham Hood, we've heard from myself and my own observations having moved out of the big cities and into a more regional area. We've heard from others along the way the importance and the significance really of what local councils actually do, something that I must admit I didn't fully appreciate until relatively recently in my life. And just recently I came across a really perfect example of a situation unfolding in a place called Albany, and I have Councillor Tom Brough. Dr. Brough, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You released a report that really caught my eye, because one of the things that I've begun to notice and I've begun to say here on the Aussie Wire is that we have these, whether they be foreign countries or multinational organisations, World Economic Forum and UN, etc., trying to deal directly with local councils. And you have an example of that. You are a councillor and you have a clear example of that from within your own council. Can you tell us about the report that you wrote?
Yeah, sure. So to give a bit of context, Albany has a number of sister city relationships. Albany was the home, or is the home, of Anzac. It was the last place many Australians in the Anzac forces saw of their home before they died in Gallipoli. So we've got a sister city relationship in Gallipoli. There are a number of other sister city relationships, though, and one of them is in Linyi in China, which was signed up in 2014. That relationship's been redundant. Not a single thing has come of it other than getting a bauble from the Consul General recently and spending some ratepayer money on a trip there to do some handshaking. A couple of weeks ago, the Consul General invited himself to come to Albany. He wanted to speak to the executive, the mayor, and the elected members. And on face value, it was just a meet and greet. But in my report, I highlight that this smile diplomacy is par for the course of I guess, the Chinese Communist Party in terms of trying to conduct influence and interference operations within Australia. And that comes from, I guess, a Mao Zedong tenet, which Xi Jinping himself quoted to the Party Congress a few years ago, talking about surrounding the city from the countryside. In this case, using local government as a means of undermining the national government.
Look, it's a fascinating sort of moment that we find ourselves in history here, because we have on the one hand a country, China, a rising superpower militarily on the one hand, but also an economic superpower on the other hand. We want to have trade relationships with these people. Me personally, I've been to China. I have no issue with the Chinese people. I have some very serious concerns about their government. But the Chinese people I find to be hardworking and people who I'd love to trade with. I'd love to have a peaceful relationship with. But we do have this situation where the Chinese Communist Party are known to be intentionally exerting influence. We have other examples, for example, the existence of what appear to be CCP police stations in cities around Australia that appear to be trying to exert Chinese Communist Party influence against expats that are living here in Australia or against the families of Chinese dissidents back in China. There does appear to be something quite insidious going on. What's the upside? What's the sell for a sister city relationship for you as a councillor? Why do they exist in the first place? Why would we even have one of them?
That's a good question, and it provides a springboard for saying, look, this visit offers an opportunity to ask some questions about some of the other sister city relationships that the city of Albany has. But the city's got its own civic affiliations policy, and that says that, look, we might consider these paradiplomatic relationships if there are shared economic interests, preferably with free trade and a good trade record. If there are direct tourism links city to city.
Sure.
If there are cultural aspects, if there are sporting aspects. And I guess in this instance, just focusing on Linyi, the relationship doesn't fulfill any of the criteria. So it sort of doesn't seem like a big deal. But what sort of drilling down on the local government sister city relationship, I mean, local governments are good at collecting rates, trying to maintain core community services like roads, making sure your rubbish gets picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Local government does not have the training or the skills or really the inclination to be engaged in expert level diplomacy. And we don't have the resources to do that. So I question, unless there are particularly unique circumstances, for instance, Albany and Gallipoli, where we have a sister city relationship, and that should be an obvious one for all the Australian listeners. I think it's hard to make a case for their value.
And what are the costs associated? You mentioned obviously a bit of a handshaking trip over to Yinley. Are you making commitments when you sign up to these sorts of relationships as a council, or is each one very much case by case? And as you say, Yinley sat dormant for many years.
Yeah, look, for Albany, all of our sister city relationships have been really on the back burner of late. I think the response to COVID-19 scuppered a lot of activity, but there wasn't much going on earlier. So in terms of what they offer, well, they offer different things. For Albany with Ligny, doesn't really offer anything. We've spoken to the administration, and there has been zero communication from the day it was signed until the day the Consul General came 9 years later. For the CCP, it does offer an opportunity to engage in sort of paradiplomatic influence operations, and it's a real bridgehead into, as I see it, a strategic regional city. In terms of the downsides, there are a lot. I mean, every time we consider benefits versus costs, there are costs. So, for instance, our administration has to keep DFAT, or sort of a part of DFAT, in the loop about everything that goes on. And that is opportunity cost for our staff, as a simple example.
Yeah. Now, can you give people who may be thinking, council is just rates and rubbish and maybe a little bit of roads or footpaths and parks and that sort of thing. You've been a council for a little while. You've observed it from the inside. Do you concur that council? I mean, this has been, and I'll be honest and put my hand up. This has been a little bit of a revelation for me. Council is a more significant level of government than what I gave it credit for. Whether it should be or not, put that aside. But as it operates today, it does seem like councils do get involved in a lot more than just those basics. Is that a correct assessment?
That's totally a correct assessment, and I'll give you two examples.
Sure.
One is influencing the culture. The sorts of cultural engagements that local governments choose to engage in or choose not to engage in do set a cultural tone. Another example is a hard economic one, and that's regarding how land is used. This is zoning. And for instance, where I am or where you are, the way in which the land on these buildings has been sort of determined to be used for is solely the arbitration of the local government. So, in our local government, we've got 12 councillors and a mayor, and we're from a diverse background, but these are the people who are ultimately saying, yes, you can use that land for this purpose, or no, you can't. And that, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much. I'm fascinated. I've only just recently come across your work. Obviously, this is a relatively recent thing. This visit from the Consular General has come in only the last few weeks. Your report has come in only the last few weeks. I do want to keep in touch with you and stay up to date with this story as it develops and see what happens with this particular city-city relationship. But also for our viewers here on the Aussie Wire, I want to keep on wrapping my own mind around and helping you to wrap your mind around the significance of local council, because I think that this is one perhaps very much underappreciated area where we could all be getting involved. Dr. Thomas Brough, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, long before the Aussie Wire was created, I, as Topher Field, the independent political commentator, was talking about water. I began by talking in 2009 about water supply into Melbourne during the drought, during the Stage 3A water restrictions that Melbourne residents at the time will remember very well. By 2012, I'd widened my view to the entire southeast of Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin, because what I discovered was happening there was, in my opinion, basically criminal. What the government had done through the Water Act of 2007 and then the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, the draft of which was released in 2011, was absolutely criminal. That's a topic that has stayed with me ever since, and in the 8 years from there until COVID came along and the world went mad, was one of the most frequent topics that I covered in my work. Of course, the world did go mad, and for 3 years you couldn't get any oxygen for any topic other than COVID-19. But that seems to be subsiding. There's obviously work to be done to hold people accountable, but the actual crisis has passed us by. Now it's time to start talking about some of these big issues once again, and water, being one that's very close to my heart, is one that I want to introduce you to. I'm a city kid. I knew nothing about this until I began to research it, and what I found absolutely shocked me. So if this is a new topic for you, stick with us, because I think you'll find that this is much more relevant to you than you may have realised. My guest today is Lloyd Polkinghorne. He is someone that I've worked with on the water issue. We were together in Canberra at a protest in December 2019, an incredible day where we thought we were getting somewhere, and then of course COVID came along and sucked all of our momentum away from us. Lloyd, thank you so much for joining me here on the Aussie Wire. How are you? It's been a long time.
Yeah, going well, thanks, Topher. It's great to see you again.
Now, I said you're someone who's been working on this water issue for a long time. Speak Up for Water as an organisation has existed for a little while. You've been working with the likes of Shelley Schooler and others, but you are very much background warriors. Most people don't know who you are. Unless you live in the regions, unless you depend on water for your livelihood, people would have no idea who you are and what you do. So can you introduce what is Speak Up for Water, what do you do, and what's the issue? Why does Speak Up for Water need to exist?
Well, Speak Up for Water is a grassroots advocacy group who's looking to represent family farmers and communities within the Murray-Darling Basin. So through water reform, we've seen this really divisive tactic used by governments, and they actually pitch irrigators against the environment, whereas a lot of family irrigators are multi-generational, so they look after the land, they seek to pass it on better than they found it, and they also have a vast history of doing environmental works on their farm, whether they be wildlife corridors or land and water management plans. And through the Basin Plan, we saw all of that sort of thrown out, and the government were trying to buy water off these farms without any consideration of the factors of what it does to communities, what it does to our environments, and how that is really crippling a lot of the towns in our region.
Absolutely. And look, I covered this in videos over the teens from 2012 until 2019. I covered this multiple times in videos. 1/3 of all of the productive water, now the productive water being the water that is diverted for irrigation is what I'm specifically talking about, was bought up by the federal government using a $13 billion taxpayer-funded slush fund and locked away. And just to give city folk or townsfolk a bit of perspective on this, imagine what would happen if the government came in and removed 1/3 of all the petrol from the petrol bowsers in the city. What would happen to the price of the remaining petrol? 2/3 of it is still there, but the price wouldn't just go up a little bit. It would absolutely skyrocket. Now, Lloyd, we saw prices as high as $1,000 a megalitre on temporary water. We saw some of the farmers that I was speaking to said that their first water purchases were made for circa $6 to $8 per megalitre back when water was abundant and cheap. And by the time I was talking to them, those individual farmers were having to pay in the order of $600 per megalitre, a 100-fold increase in the cost of water. Talk to me about why water is such a critical input for a lot of primary production, and what happens to them when their cost of production goes up, but they've got all this debt from all of the infrastructure they've got on the farm.
Yeah, so as far as irrigated agriculture in the basin, water is a critical part. We live in a variable climate, so we've got dry times and wet times, and irrigation allows us the ability to mitigate those and have reasonable production to be sustainable. Now, the water they targeted, so they've bought 80% of the water out of the Southern Connected System, is 80% of the water they have came from the Southern Connected System. So it's quite small geographical areas of the basin. Our areas here were historically part of the floodplain, and so early settlers worked out that it was easy to irrigate because they didn't have to do great big projects or move heaps of dirt or set up pumps. And so that water existed within this floodplain, and then they sort of metered and regulated it. And there's two factors that really drive the price of water. One is inflows into the dams and storages, which results in an allocation. And the other one is actually the resource that is available. So how big the consumptive pool is. Because when the government actually buys water, it retains its characteristics as productive water, but it's held in environmental accounts. And so we don't sort of see that water coming back into the pool. When it comes to prices, there's two prices that are relevant. One is a temporary water price, so I can buy water year on year, and the other one is a permanent price to actually own that entitlement, and you get an allocation depending on the resource within the dams. Now, when I first started farming, I wanted to buy water. Water was about $200 per megalitre for a permanent entitlement, so each year I'd get an allocation on that. Since the manipulation of the market and the introduction of water traders and speculators, that same water entitlement is now $1,800. And so you don't actually get a greater return per megalitre. It's just the capital price of that water's increased.
Yeah.
Now, that's a general security entitlement, and a high security entitlement has gone from sort of $2,000 up to $7,500 where I am. So that is a huge impact on young farmers or young people who want to get into farming. They now essentially priced out of the market. And you also see a lot of people who are at the retirement age who will now hold that asset to sort of trade it and make money as they back off in their working life. When it comes to temporary water, when the government was first proposing the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, I used to go to water meetings, and the Victorians were a good one. They'd say to farmers, you can sell your permanent entitlement and you can rely on the temporary market. We've sort of, water trades for $10, $20. You can release all this capital and you can still farm. But what actually happened is that the market or the pool of water got smaller. The competition for water got greater because we had all these other factors coming in. So the government pushed highest return per megalitre. So all the rules and restrictions we once had sort of all went out the window, and you had this greater demand for the water. And so in a drier time, yes, we saw water up to $1,000 per megalitre for a temporary.
For temporary water,
Temporary water, which is completely unsustainable. So varying crops and irrigation pursuits have different returns per megalitre. And so, if you're a dairy farmer, you may be able to pay $200 to $300 per meg temporary water and still break even. Whereas some of the higher value crops like permanent plantings, such as almonds, they can pay up to $1,000 per megalitre. And one of the things that sort of went out the window that I find criminal is the original irrigation areas. We actually had structures in place to look after things like salinity, water deliverability. We also had water use intensity limits on our farm, so you could only use so much per megalitre, so many megalitres per hectare, and grow certain types of crops. Now that's all sort of been gone out the window, and we've seen new irrigation areas just explode with plantings of almonds, and they're going further down the system. They've gone on sandhills, so they're not traditionally irrigation or floodplains. And they also sit on top of great salt shelves. So you're seeing huge salinity problems. And we have to appreciate that this is a plan to save the Murray and to restore the balance within the basin. And we're actually seeing the opposite happen.
Well, this is a point I'd like to sort of finish with here is the idea of this plan was this supposed triple bottom line, that it was going to be good for food production, it was going to be good for regional communities, and it was going to be good for the environment. That was the promise. That was the basis upon which the government said, you know what, we're going to spend $13 billion worth of taxpayers' money. It has been an absolute disaster for farmers. Removing 1/3 of an essential input from any given productive system is going to destroy that system. In turn, it's been terrible for communities because as farmers close down, as farms consolidate and multiple families move out and get taken over by a corporate conglomerate, well, now you've got less kids in school, you've got less people shopping at the local RGA, you've got less of a community to keep that area alive. And then finally, it's been terrible for the environment. And a point that I want to bounce off from what you've just said, we're seeing these enormous almond plantations just going out hectare after hectare down in the Sunraysia region, which as far as the Murray-Darling Basin system is concerned, that's a long way downstream. They require huge amounts of water, and that means that huge amounts of water have to be run all the way down the system, from whether it's Dartmouth or whichever dam it may be, from the Hume Weir all the way down. That water capacity, the river only has so much, and we're seeing the effects of this on the river, aren't we, Lloyd?
Yeah, we've seen a massive rate of erosion increase. So traditionally, the river erodes a little bit. It's an earthen channel, and it varies with flooding and all the rest of it. But since 2010, there's places here that have lost 14 metres of riverbank with erosion. So there's been some flooding events or some high rivers that I've seen a 500 millimetre notch, so half a metre notch forming in the river. And these constant high flows that they're running through our area. So our part of the Murray was historically the Goulburn River. So 40,000 years ago, when the Cadell tilt or fault formed, actually re-diverted the Murray from its historical bed down our part, which is the Goulburn. So it's quite narrow here. And so when they're moving huge volumes of water, we get the water out of the Goulburn system as well as a lot of water out of the Upper Murray system. And so we're seeing this perpetual high volumes and velocities of water coming through. And they sit at a static level, or they had been sitting at a static level for quite a long time, and you get this notch in the bank. Now, we're trying to save the river, so there's some protections in place on how you move water. So one is you can't impact water quality, so turbidity, but we're seeing that dramatically increase as we get all this soil and sediment. The other thing is that there's all these habitats that actually rely on the river. So, kingfishers nest in the bank, and we have platypus and even animals that try to go for a drink. Historically, our banks were like a 45-degree slope, but we're now seeing them become cliff faces as they're sort of undermined and the top collapses in. And there are protections in place in the 2007 Water Act on how they move water and that it can't impact the river channel, but they don't seem to get implemented. There seems to be these external forces that, they say now they're trying to maximise a resource and they want to deliver water to all their customers, and flood mitigation goes out the window, and also the quality of the river and how we actually operate it.
Yeah. Well, this triple bottom line is an absolute joke, and I'll add a fourth one to that. This has been bad for farmers and food production. It's been bad for communities. It's been bad for the environment, and it's been terrible for taxpayers. This is one of the greatest policy disasters in Australian federal history, in my opinion. Lloyd Polkinghorne, thank you so much for joining me on the Aussie Wire. I do want to have you back as this story progresses. It's one of those long, slow burn stories. I've been talking about it now for the better part of 10 years. I know you've been talking about it for even longer. We'll probably be talking about it for another 20 years into the future, but I appreciate you coming on, and I plan to stay across this story as anything changes. Thanks, Lloyd.
Thanks, Topher. Cheers.
Well, here at the Aussie Wire, we are all about truth, freedom, and hope. And regular viewers will have heard me say many times before that action brings hope. Action brings agency, a sense of control, a sense of having an influence over your destiny, and that in turn completely changes how you see your circumstances. It's an amazing thing that I saw firsthand during the anti-lockdown protests on the streets of Melbourne. So I have enormous respect for anyone that's had the courage to take action. And I also know the incredible positive benefits that they would have enjoyed despite the storm that often comes with taking action. I know all about that personally, and my next guest does as well. She was whistleblowing and speaking truth to power before it was cool, and risked everything to reveal what others have said now was, in hindsight, the biggest intelligence failure in the biggest intelligence security failure in Australian history. Quite an extraordinary story, an extraordinary woman. Monica, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you, Topher, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Back in 2009, during the global financial crisis, I was involved in uncovering a scandal that, to all intents and purposes, was so great, as you have just said, that it was left people. It was unfixable. it was a terrible situation to find myself in. I was recruited by the Defence Intelligence and Security Authority, DSA Brisbane, as a contractor during the financial global crisis when jobs were very scarce. And they used this time of crisis to their advantage. What they did was, knowing that people couldn't find work, they exploited contractors. They brought us in deliberately to be trained to deceive ASIO. We didn't know at the time that we were being trained to deceive ASIO and breach the parliamentary vetting procedures. That was what I found out we were doing later on. But we were trained. We were constantly threatened. Huge walls were put up between the contractors and the vetting staff. The defence vetting staff had no idea what we were doing, and we had no idea what they were doing. It was a simple case of deception, and reinforced with coercion and constant threats. Our jobs were incredibly insecure. We were threatened daily with job loss. There was at least one sacking a week, and the sackings occurred with people just being told an hour before knock-off time that they wouldn't be required the next day. We were never given desks. We were always wandering around trying to find somewhere to sit. Or if we were allocated a desk, it was 1 or 2 days. We were made to feel like we were superfluous, we were uncomfortable, and we were people who were disposable and not really welcome in the organisation.
Monica, can I interrupt? For those that don't know your story, and I should apologise to viewers, the internet connection, Monica is based in regional inland New South Wales, and unfortunately the internet connection we have is very poor. But Monica, we are hearing your story, but I just want to stop for a moment for anyone that really has no idea what you're talking about. You said that you were breaching parliamentary due process. What was the actual role? You were deceiving the vetting staff. What was the role that you were performing, and why was this being done at all? This is a systemic thing. This was actually, you were brought in as part of the system. What were they doing?
What they were doing was competing. The hierarchy of DSA had decided to charge for clearances. Prior to this decision, clearances were for top secret, confidential and restricted were basically free, and they were classified and vetted through the military. But in 2007-8, the decision was taken to have these clearances taken out of the hands of the military and put into the hands of defence civilians. Right. And they decided to charge fairly high rates for each of these clearances. There was also a competition on at the time between DSA agencies throughout Australia, and I was working in the Queensland agency, and we were brought in to streamline the vetting process by filling in gaps so that people wouldn't, the real vetting analysts would spend time making phone calls, checking the information, making sure that it was correct. We didn't know that that's what they were doing. We were told, you just take these applications. If they have gaps in them, fill in the gaps and put them through to ASIO, because ASIO, if there's a problem, ASIO will know how to deal with it on the other end. So we thought, okay, our job is just to do this. We weren't allowed to ask questions. We weren't allowed to talk to anybody, even the person sitting beside us. we had to just do as we were told.
So the upshot of this is that we're giving security clearances to people that may not have qualified for those levels of clearance because you were brought in specifically for the purpose of falsifying their information.
That's exactly right. That's what we were brought in to do. And we didn't know that that's what we were brought in to do. And the turnover of staff was really high and really rapid because as soon as they thought that someone was getting an inkling of what was going on, they got rid of them and brought in new staff. And so this was continual. I worked there for 7 months. I lasted longer than many others. And the reason I did this, because even though I felt that there was things not quite right, I didn't actually want to believe that our intelligence agency would do anything to harm Australia. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time saying, oh, no, it couldn't be. This couldn't be. This has got to be my misunderstanding. I'm the one who doesn't understand. And I kept giving them the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't until I had been there 6 months and various circumstances all worked together. One of the barriers to communication with the defence analysts was broken down because I was actually put in a pod with three of the defence analysts, and it was Christmas, and Christmas breaks down barriers. So they started talking to me. They didn't know that I wasn't allowed to talk to them. And they included me in their conversations, and I started to see that the things and to hear that the things that they were doing and the things that I was trained to do were completely different.
Incompatible.
And I started to recognise that I'd been lied to and I was possibly doing the wrong thing and betraying Australia, and that was a horrific thing as far as I was concerned. And so on one particular day, I thought, I've got to bite the bullet here. I've got to know for sure whether or not I am actually being used to actually break the law. And so I put aside 3 applications that were really in need of proper vetting. And I decided to take them to the team leader. I wasn't allowed to ask questions, and this was to the defence team leader who was in charge of what the contractors were doing. And I wasn't allowed to ask questions, so I just laid them on the desk in front of him and asked him, or just told him, this one has this problem, this has this problem, this one has this problem. And at that time, he just picked the files up, stood up from the desk and faced me, and I knew when he did that I just stood my ground, and he snapped the folders closed in front of me and just said, be creative. And I knew when he said that this was outright deception. If he had told me that these needed to go and be vetted properly, then I would have known that I'd been getting it wrong all of that time. And since he told me just be creative, I knew I knew that we were being lied to, we were being deceived, and this was completely wrong. Sitting with the vet showed me that the questions that were the gaps in these applications were the very things that they were ringing up and asking people to provide. They were asking for the proper information. They were filling the gaps the right way by getting the correct information, and we weren't. Anyway, as it turned out, the number of applications that went through that were seen later on to be corrupted and false was in the tens of thousands. There were 20,000 corrected paper applications. There was twice as many non-paper applications that had come through straight through the computer, and they could not be checked. They couldn't be seen. The changes on those had no shadow that could be noticed by anybody. And so what they found ultimately was that this was a huge number of possible very bad situations for Australia. And
we've given
the problem was so hard, and it had been going on for so long that it was unfixable.
Well,
it could never be.
The terrifying thing is that foreign powers,
it's unfixable.
Foreign powers work incredibly hard to try and embed agents, get them security clearances and these sorts of things. We know that across a period of years and across tens of thousands of applications, there will without question be some foreign operatives in amongst those people that they were hoping to slip through. And unfortunately, through no fault of your own, the role that you were fulfilling was helping those people to slip through. And this seems...
Absolutely it was.
This seems preposterous to me. So I want to run it past you one more time and make sure I've understood this. The reason they were doing this was for profit, because they as a government agency had now started charging a fee in order to get it. It's astonishing. What was the upshot? Now, you blew the whistle. You and I believe two other people had the courage to step forward. Have criminal charges been laid? Have people gone to prison for this? Wow.
This was sabotage and possibly even espionage, but it wasn't the people who did this, even though they were named in the IGIS report, the IGIS being the highest intelligence investigative body in Australia. It's directly under the Governor-General and has with the power of a Royal Commission. So the IGIS determined and named the people involved, and it's out there on the internet for anybody to look up. But there were no criminal charges laid because at that time there was no sabotage or espionage laws that could be enforced, and those laws weren't introduced until 2018, and now it's a 15 to 20 year jail term, and it's just a shame that it couldn't be retrospective. It needed to be. I believe these men should have gone to jail
well, Monica,
for what they did.
Monica, I tip my hat to you for having the courage to have, I guess, in the first instance, actually admitted to yourself and acknowledged what it was that you were a part of. Once you had that evidence and you had that conversation, those folders got snapped in front of your face and you were told to just get creative. It takes a certain amount of honesty and courage to even admit to yourself that you've been sucked in to become a part of the problem in the first place. And you had the courage to do that, and then you had the courage to step forward. So, Monica, I tip my hat to you. Unfortunately, the internet has been really patchy throughout our interview. So what I'm going to do, Monica, with your permission, I'd love to actually come and visit you sometime. Where you live is not that far away from where I live now. So I'd love to come and visit you sometime and do an in-person interview with you. Just sit down, we'll get a couple of cameras and set them up and really just get you to tell your whole story, because I think from everything I've heard so far, it sounds fascinating. I haven't read your book yet, but I will get a hold of that and I will read that before I conduct this interview. So Monica, would you be willing to do that?
I would love to do that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Monica, thank you so much for coming.
I'm grateful to you that
Sorry, there's so much delay. There's so much delay in the audio. I apologise. I wasn't trying to talk over you. But thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire, and this won't be the last that we'll be speaking with you. Thank you so much, Monica.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com. And if you'd like to support us so that we can keep doing even more, then you can become an insider at theaussiewire.locals.com/support. The link is in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire News.